Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head, the way water takes the weight of a boat that has finally stopped fighting the current. There is nothing left for you to carry tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to remember, nothing to reach for. Just this quiet voice, and a story that is going to move slowly, on purpose, so that you can drift down into it the way you drift down into warm water, one gentle inch at a time. I want you to picture a small glass tube. It is not much bigger than your thumb, sealed at both ends, and it is resting on a rough wooden shelf in a shed at the edge of Paris more than 100 years ago. The shed has a glass roof that leaks when it rains, and it is cold in there, colder than a room ought to be, and it is dark. And in that darkness the little glass tube is glowing. Not brightly, not like a lamp. It is glowing with a soft, pale, bluish light of its own, a light that comes from nowhere you can point to, a light that simply exists inside the glass, faint and steady and strange. The woman who made it, who pulled it out of tons of grey rock with her own 2 hands, wrote that the glowing tubes looked like faint fairy lights. That is her phrase. Faint fairy lights, hanging in the dark of a leaky shed, giving off a glow so gentle and so beautiful that she and her husband used to walk back to the laboratory at night, after the work was done, just to stand in the doorway and look at them. She loved that light. She carried a little of it in her coat pocket sometimes, a small sealed tube kept close to her body, warm against her side, because radium gives off a faint warmth as well as a faint light, and she found that lovely too. She kept another glowing tube in the drawer of her desk, and now and then she would slide the drawer open in a dim room just to see it shine. She thought it was one of the most beautiful things in the world. And it was. And it was also, very quietly, and without any noise or drama at all, writing itself into her hands and into her blood, and into the deep marrow of her bones, one invisible day at a time. Here is the thread I want you to hold on to tonight, loosely, the way you would hold a thread while you fall asleep, not gripping it, just letting it rest across your fingers. That woman has been dead for 90 years. And still, to this day, you are not allowed to touch her notebooks with your bare hands, her laboratory ledgers, the pages where she wrote her measurements in careful ink. Her papers, even a cookbook that once sat in her kitchen, are kept now in boxes lined with lead in a great library in Paris, and if you want to open one and read what she wrote, you have to sign a form that releases the library from responsibility for what might happen to you. You have to wear protection. Because the light she loved is still in the paper. It never left. And to understand why, and to understand who she was, we have to go all the way back, slowly, to a cold apartment, in a city that was not even allowed to be the city it was, in a country that had been rubbed off the map. Before we begin that long walk backward, let me ask you one small thing, and then I will not ask anything of you again. Wherever you are lying in the dark right now, in whatever country, on whatever coast, I would like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. If you feel like it, whenever you wake, leave the name of your town in the comments, and I will read it. And if you are new here and you would like more of these slow journeys into the past, you can subscribe, and the harbour lights will be on for you. That is all. Now let the story carry you. We are going to Warsaw. It is the 7th of November in the year 1867, and it is winter, or near enough to winter, in a city that belongs, on every map that anyone is allowed to draw, to Russia. This is Congress Poland, the part of the old Polish nation that the Russian Empire holds in its fist, and Warsaw is its heart, but a heart that is not permitted to beat in its own language. On that November day, in an apartment that smells of chalk dust and boiled cabbage, and the cold that seeps through old windows, a little girl is born, the fifth and youngest child of a family that has more learning than money. They name her Maria Salomea Skłodowska. Say it slowly to yourself as you lie there. Maria Salomea Skłodowska. That is the name the world would later shorten and soften into 2 syllables that everyone knows. But tonight she is only Maria, the baby of the house, the smallest of 5. Her father is a teacher. His name is Władysław Skłodowski, and he teaches mathematics and physics, the 2 subjects that will one day be his youngest daughter's whole life. Though, of course, he cannot know that yet, leaning over the cradle. He is a serious man, a learned man, the kind of man who keeps scientific instruments on a shelf in the sitting room, glass tubes and a barometer and a small electroscope, delicate things that the children are not really supposed to touch, but that little Maria will grow up staring at, the way another child might stare at toys behind glass. Those instruments, gleaming and forbidden and full of some invisible purpose she does not yet understand, are among the first things she loves. Her mother is called Bronisława, the same name that one of Maria's older sisters carries, and she is a remarkable woman in her own quiet way. She runs a boarding school for girls, a respectable school, and for the early years of Maria's life the family lives in rooms attached to it, so that the little girl grows up inside a place made entirely of learning, surrounded by older girls with their books and their lessons and their whispered secrets. A house where knowledge is not a luxury, but the very air. To grow up poor is one thing. To grow up poor in a house that treats the life of the mind as sacred is another thing entirely, and it shapes a child in ways that last a lifetime. But there is a shadow over this house, and it is a shadow that a great many families in that century lived under, and it has a name. Tuberculosis, the slow disease of the lungs, the wasting cough, the illness that took so many and that no one then could stop. Maria's mother has it. For years she carries it quietly, growing thinner, coughing behind closed doors, careful never to kiss her children for fear of passing it to them, holding herself always a little apart out of love, which is its own particular kind of sorrow for a small child to feel and not understand. Imagine being very young and knowing your mother loves you, and also never being drawn fully into her arms, never being kissed on the cheek, because she is protecting you from the thing that is killing her. That was Maria's childhood. A house full of learning, and a mother who kept her distance out of tenderness. And before the worst comes, another grief arrives first, because griefs so rarely come one at a time. Maria has an older sister named Zofia, and Zofia catches typhus, a fever spread in those crowded years by lice and by hardship, and typhus takes her. The little girl loses her sister. And then, not long after, in 1878, when Maria is only 10 years old, the long, slow illness finishes its work, and her mother dies of the tuberculosis she had fought and hidden for so many years. 10 years old enough to understand it completely, old enough for it to become a part of who she is. Some children, struck by a loss like that, close up like a flower at dusk. Maria did something else. She poured herself into her work, into her books and her lessons, and she became, by every account, the best student anyone around her had ever seen, as though she had decided, without ever saying it aloud, that the way through grief was through the mind, through problems that had clean answers in a world that had just proven it did not. Now I want you to understand the strange, heavy thing about being a brilliant Polish child in Warsaw in those years, because it is the water this whole story swims in, and it is a kind of pressure that presses down on everything that follows. The Russian Empire did not merely rule Poland, it set out, deliberately and patiently, to erase the fact that Poland had ever existed at all. In the schools, the children were taught in Russian, not in their own Polish tongue. Their history, the long, proud, complicated history of their own nation, was not to be taught. The Polish language itself was suppressed, pushed out of the classroom and into the whispered privacy of homes. And Russian inspectors would come to the schools unannounced, walking the corridors, opening the doors of classrooms to check that the children were being made Russian, that no forbidden Polish word was being spoken, that no map of the vanished country was pinned to any wall. There is a story from Maria's school days, and it is the kind of thing that tells you everything about the childhood she had. When an inspector was expected, a signal would run through the school, and the Polish lessons, the real ones, the forbidden ones, would be swept out of sight in a moment, the Polish books hidden away, and the class would rearrange itself into a picture of obedient Russian schooling. And sometimes the teacher would call on Maria because Maria could do it, because Maria spoke perfect Russian and knew every fact the inspector might ask for. And she would stand up in front of this stranger in his uniform and answer his questions flawlessly, in his language, about his empire, hiding the whole secret world of her real education behind a calm and clever face. And when the inspector left satisfied, and the danger passed, more than once the little girl who had performed so perfectly would sit back down and quietly begin to cry. From the strain of it, from the shame and the fear and the sheer unfairness of having to pretend her own country and her own language did not exist in order to be allowed to learn at all. Hold that image gently in the dark, a gifted child, top of her class, having to lie about who she is in order to be educated at all, and paying for the lie in tears afterward. That pressure did not break her. It forged her. The patience she would later need to stir a boiling cauldron of rock for 4 years to extract a single speck of a new element, the patience to fail and measure again, the sheer refusal to be told what she could not do, all of it began here, in a Warsaw classroom, under the eyes of an empire that wanted her to forget her own name. And she did not forget. She excelled. She excelled the way water finds every crack, completely and without any noise. In 1883, when she was 15 years old, she finished her secondary schooling at the very top of her class, and she was given a gold medal for it. A gold medal in a school system designed to grind the Polishness out of her, awarded to a Polish girl for being better at everything than anyone the empire could put in front of her. Picture that medal for a moment, small and heavy and cool, pressed into the palm of a 15-year-old who had cried behind an inspector's back only a few years before. It should have been the beginning of everything. A brilliant mind, proven, decorated, ready for the great universities where such minds were meant to go. Except that the great university was closed to her. Not because she was not clever enough, she was more than clever enough. It was closed to her for a reason that had nothing to do with her mind at all. The University of Warsaw, the doorway that a young man with her marks would have walked through without a second thought, did not admit women. Not one. The gates were simply shut, and no amount of gold medals would open them, because the rule was not about ability. It was about being a girl, and there was, on the surface of things, in the world as it was arranged in Warsaw in 1883. Nothing whatever to be done about it. So here is a 15-year-old, 16, 17, the finest student anyone has met, holding a gold medal and a mind like a lens that gathers light, standing in front of a locked door in an occupied country, forbidden to speak her own language in school, and forbidden by her sex to go any further in learning at all. And you might think, lying there in the warm dark, that this is where the story stops. That this is where a brilliant girl in a hard world simply disappears into an ordinary life, married off, worn down, her gold medal in a drawer, her mind spent on small things, the way so many brilliant girls in so many hard centuries have quietly disappeared, their names never reaching us at all. You might think that the door being locked was the end of it, but there was another door. It was not on any map. It did not have a name carved over it in stone. It moved from week to week, and you had to be told where it was, and you had to be trusted, and you had to be brave. Because behind it, in secret, in defiance of the whole weight of the Russian Empire, someone was quietly teaching the very things that were forbidden. In the very language that was banned, to the very people, the women, who were not allowed to learn. Where that door was, and how a poor girl with no money and no permission found her way through it, is where we are going next. Before we step through it, let me leave you with a small, quiet thought, the way you might leave a candle burning low in a window. After years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible for me. And once it did, everything changed. Learning came easier. The energy in the day was real again. The mind stayed sharp and calm. Sleeping like a child, night after night, changed everything. If you ever want the exact system that made that possible, it is waiting for you in the pinned comments, whenever you are ready. There is no hurry. It will be there tomorrow. For now, stay here in the dark with me and let us go find that hidden door. The door had a name that its students used only among themselves, softly, the way you say the name of something you love and fear losing. They called it the Flying University. In Polish, Uniwersytet Latający, the university that flies, and the name meant exactly what it said, because this was a university with no building, no campus, no lecture hall, with its name over the arch. It could not have any of those things, because it was illegal. If the Russian authorities had found it, the people who ran it and the people who attended it would have faced real punishment. Prison, exile, the ruin of a family. And so it flew, it moved. It had no fixed nest, because a fixed nest is the first thing an inspector finds. Here is how it worked, and I want you to picture it slowly, because it is one of the most quietly heroic arrangements in the whole history of learning. In apartments across Warsaw, in ordinary sitting rooms and dining rooms in ordinary buildings. On rotating evenings, small groups of students would gather, quietly, a few at a time, so as not to draw attention, arriving from different directions, at different moments, the way you would arrive at a thing you did not want watched. And in that borrowed room, with the curtains drawn, a teacher would come and give a real university lecture, in Polish, on the forbidden subjects, on the history of Poland, on literature, on the sciences, on all the knowledge that the empire wanted these people never to have. And the next week, or the next session, it would be a different apartment, a different sitting room, a different quiet building on a different Warsaw street, so that no pattern could form, so that no watcher could learn where to wait. A university that folded itself up at the end of each evening and vanished into the ordinary city and unfolded itself somewhere else a few nights later. a university you carried in your head and in the addresses whispered to you by someone you trusted. And the most remarkable thing of all, the thing that mattered most to a certain gold medal girl standing at her locked and lawful door, was this: the Flying University admitted women. Where the real, legal, stone-walled University of Warsaw shut its gates against every woman in the country, this secret, moving, lamp-lit university did the opposite. It welcomed them. It taught them. In those borrowed rooms, a young woman forbidden by law from higher learning could sit among others like her and receive, in the language of her own suppressed nation, the education the whole visible world was determined to deny her. It was defiance folded inside defiance, the forbidden language teaching the forbidden subjects to the forbidden students. All of it happening quietly behind the drawn curtains of respectable apartments, while the empire went on believing it had closed every door. And into those rooms, in her late teenage years, came Maria Skłodowska, and her sister Bronisława with her, the two of them among the young women who climbed the ordinary staircases of ordinary Warsaw buildings on ordinary evenings, knocked in the way they had been told to knock, and stepped into a hidden university that could be anywhere and was, tonight, here. For Maria this was not a hobby and not a comfort. It was the only higher learning available to her in the whole of her occupied country, and she took it exactly as seriously as she took everything, which is to say completely, with the same fierce, patient hunger that had won her the gold medal, the same refusal to be smaller than her own mind that would one day send her stirring cauldrons of rock in a freezing shed for a light no one else could see. But even the Flying University, brave as it was, could only take her so far. It could feed her mind in secret rooms, but it could not grant her a real degree, could not put a laboratory in her hands, could not give her the thing she had begun to understand she wanted more than anything, which was to do science, really do it, out in the wider world where the true universities stood open, in cities where a woman with a mind like hers might actually be let inside. There was such a city. It was far away, and it cost money the family did not have, and getting there would require a sacrifice so patient and so selfless that it is almost hard to believe two sisters made it and kept it. Because before Maria Skłodowska could ever walk into a real university, before she could ever hold that glowing tube in a Paris shed, before any of it, she and her sister would have to make a promise to each other, in the cold, about whose turn would come first, and who would wait. And who waited, and how long, and what it cost her, is where we will go next, when we take the next slow step down into the dark. For now, let the Flying University keep flying somewhere in the Warsaw night, its lamps lit behind drawn curtains. A young woman with a gold medal sitting among the forbidden, listening, learning, waiting for her turn. Let the city be quiet around it. Let the snow, if there is snow, come down soft and slow over the rooftops, over the vanished country, over the hidden rooms full of stubborn light. There is nothing you need to do with any of it. Just hold it gently, the girl and the gold medal and the moving university and the promise not yet made, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the warm dark of your own safe room. 150 years and a whole world away from that cold Warsaw winter. Breathe out. We are only at the beginning of her long life, and we have a long, slow way to go together. All the way to a leaky shed and a faint blue light, all the way to 2 prizes and a rainy street and a lead-lined box in a Paris library that no one may open with bare hands. But none of that is tonight's task. Tonight's task is only to rest and to drift and to let the story hold you the way the harbour holds a boat. The girl is still in Warsaw. The light has not been found yet, and you are safe, and warm, and slowly, gently, coming loose from the day. Let us stay here a moment longer, in the hush before her turn comes, and simply breathe. There is a particular kind of quiet that lives in a room where people have agreed, gently and completely, to break the law together. It is not a frightened quiet. It is the quiet of a candle that has learned not to gutter, of a page turned slowly so it will not be heard through the wall, of a dozen coats hung by the door, as if this were only an evening among friends, and not a whole forbidden country being kept alive in a rented parlour. The flying university had no walls of its own, and that was the whole secret of it. It could not be raided, because it was never in the same place twice. One week the lessons would gather in an apartment near the old town, the lamps turned low, and the next week they would move on to another set of rooms across the city, and the week after that to another, drifting through Warsaw like something that could only be seen out of the corner of the eye. Uniwersytet Latający, they called it, the university that flies, and it flew precisely so that the men who came looking would always arrive to find an ordinary family at an ordinary supper, and nothing at all to write down in their little books. What they taught there were the things the empire had decided a Polish child was not permitted to know. The history of a nation that had been rubbed off the map, the literature that was supposed to be forgotten, the sciences taught seriously and rigorously by people who owned almost nothing but their own learning and were determined to pass it on before it could be taken. And it did something that almost no proper university in Europe would do in those years. It let the women in. It sat them at the same tables as the men, handed them the same difficult pages, and asked as much of them. For a girl who had already come first in a school built to teach her to think in another language, who had already carried home a gold medal from a system designed to make her small, this was the first room that seemed built to her actual size. She could go as far as her mind could carry her. There was only one problem, and it was not a problem of ability, and it was not a problem of courage, and it could not be solved by any lesson taught in any of those borrowed rooms. The problem was money and time and the simple arithmetic of two sisters who both wanted the same impossible thing and could not, between them, afford it twice. That question sat in the lamplight beside her, night after night, unanswered, waiting. But we will come to how they answered it in a breath. Let the question rest a moment first. Before we take that next slow step, let me say one quiet thing, and then we will go straight back into the dark rooms of Warsaw. For a long time I lay awake at night with a mind that would not stop, turning over the day like a stone, and real sleep felt like something other people were allowed, and I was not. And then it became possible again. Deep sleep, the kind that actually mends you, so that learning comes easier and the mind stays clear and steady through the day. If you have been lying awake the way I once did, and you would like to know the exact quiet method that let me find my way back to real rest, it is waiting for you in the pinned comment below, for whenever you want it. There is nothing to do about it now. Now there is only the story, and the dark, and the slow way down. So, two sisters, and one road out, and not enough of anything to send them both along it at once. Bronisława, the elder, wanted to be a doctor, and to become one she would have to go to Paris, because Paris would teach a woman medicine, and Warsaw would not. Maria wanted the sciences with the same steady hunger. And what they did, in the cold, was the thing that this whole long life will turn out to be built from, though neither of them could have known it then. They made a pact, not a grand one, a practical one, the kind you make quietly across a kitchen table with your breath showing in the air. One of them would go first, and the other would pay for it, and then, when the first one was standing on her own feet at last, she would reach back and pay for the second in her turn. They would take it in order. They would wait for each other. And the one who agreed to wait, the one who agreed to hold her own dream still and unopened while she earned the money to send her sister ahead, was Maria. She would go out into other people's houses to do it. She would become a governess, which in those years meant leaving your own family to live inside someone else's, teaching their children their letters and their sums and their little polite accomplishments for wages that a young woman was expected to be grateful for. She took work where she could find it, out in the countryside, in the houses of families who had land and needed someone clever and cheap to raise up their sons and daughters. She sent the money home, and onward to Paris, to Bronisława, and she went on teaching herself in whatever hours were left over, in borrowed books, late, alone, keeping her own mind alive, the way you might keep a small fire burning in a room no one else uses, feeding it a little at a time, so that when her turn finally came, if it ever came, she would not have gone cold. Picture how long that is. Not a season of waiting. Not a single winter of it, year after year, of watching your own life stand politely in the corner while you spend your youth teaching another family's children the things you would rather be learning yourself. Year after year of the letters going one way, from a cold house in the Polish countryside to a lecture hall in Paris, carrying the money that would make your sister a doctor while you turned another page of arithmetic by candlelight and told yourself, again, that your turn was coming. It is one of the most patient things a person has ever done, and almost nobody tells it, because it is not dramatic and it does not glow in the dark. It is only a young woman keeping a promise, slowly, for a very long time, in the ordinary way that the largest things are usually kept. And out there in one of those country houses, in the middle of all that waiting, something happened that had nothing to do with science at all, and that would quietly bruise her, and that she would carry for the rest of her life. But that is the next slow step down, and it is not tonight's to climb. Tonight there is only the waiting, and the letters, and the small, stubborn fire she kept burning for herself in the dark. Let it burn there gently. You do not have to keep watch over it. You are moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off. The house in Shuki was not so different from others she had known. A larger house than some, set in the countryside of Russian, controlled Poland the way those houses always were, a little apart from the road, a little set back from everything, with rooms that belonged to the family and rooms that belonged to the governess, and the two kinds of rooms never quite touching, no matter how long you lived in them. The Ororski family had land and standing, and the particular confidence of people who have both, and they had children who needed instruction in French and arithmetic and the other things a well-educated young woman from Warsaw could provide if she was willing to keep sensible hours and know her place, which Maria Skłodowska was, and which she did. She arrived with her books and her mathematics, and the accumulated discipline of years, the same girl who had finished at the top of her secondary class at 15 with a gold medal and then watched the University of Warsaw's gates stay shut to her because she was a woman, the same girl who had learned in stolen rooms and borrowed apartments what the official world was not prepared to let her learn. She arrived and she taught, and she read in the evenings, and she sent the money to Bronisława in Paris, and she waited. But she was young. She was 21 years old, or thereabouts, and she had not yet fully learned the cost of certain kinds of warmth. And there was a young man in the house. His name was Kazimierz Orłowski. He was the family's son, home from his studies, and he would go on, in the years after this, to become a distinguished mathematician. The kind of person the history of Polish mathematics remembers with some tenderness and precision. But in these years he was simply a young man who was drawn to the governess, who read too late into the night, and who could talk about mathematics as if she had built it herself, and who had a kind of focused, undeflected attention that is always, its own kind of magnetism. They fell in love, or something like it, or whatever word fits the thing that happens when two young people with serious minds find each other in a house at the edge of a Polish winter and understand, perhaps suddenly, that the other person is also real. He asked to marry her. Or that is what the record suggests. In the quiet way, the record suggests things it did not witness directly. And his family said no. They said no, because she was a governess. Because she was the person who lived in the other kind of room and sent money home, and who had no family estate, no dowry, no standing of the kind that made a match suitable. He was their son. She was their employee. And whatever the two of them had built between themselves in the evenings over mathematics and conversation, the structure of the thing, the social architecture of who could marry whom and why, did not bend for it. The Orłowski family was not cruel. They were simply of their world, and their world had clear ideas about what a penniless governess was and was not. And so the answer was no. And Maria remained in the house, because she needed the work, and because Bronisława still had months of medical training ahead of her in Paris, and because a promise was a promise even when the person keeping it was also quietly bleeding somewhere inside from an old wound that had nothing to do with science. This is the part of her life that people tend to move through quickly, as if it were merely the space before the important parts began. But it was not. She spent years there in that governess position and others, and the waiting was its own education, not in physics or mathematics, not the kind that earns you a degree or fills a notebook, but the other kind, the kind that teaches you what you are made of when everything is delayed and the small fire you've kept going for yourself is the only warmth you have. She was teaching herself, still. Teaching herself to endure the specific pain of being held in place when the whole shape of your mind is pointed towards somewhere else, somewhere you can see so clearly it almost makes the waiting worse. Bronisława qualified. She became a doctor. She and her husband, settled now in Paris, wrote to Maria and said, "Come, your turn." It was 1891. Maria Skłodowska packed her bags in that Polish countryside, and she went. The train journey from Warsaw to Paris is a long one, through towns and borders and landscapes that change slowly, that thaw as you travel west and south, the heavy Polish winter giving way to something greener and older and louder. She arrived in a city that was, in every visible dimension, nothing like what she had come from. Paris in 1891 was electric in the original and the metaphorical sense. The first public electric street lamps had gone up just a few years before. The Eiffel Tower was only 2 years old, and many Parisians still thought it was hideous. And the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, was one of the most ancient and eminent institutions of learning in the Western world. with lecture halls that had been turning out scholars since the Middle Ages. She enrolled. She registered as Marie, the French version of Maria, the name she would carry for the rest of her life, and into history. She was 23 years old, and she was, at last, exactly where she had been trying to go. What she found there was not, in the immediate physical sense, comfortable. She had very little money. She lived in a cheap garret room in the Latin Quarter, the student neighbourhood that climbed the hill on the south bank of the Seine, and the room was the kind of room that seems romantic in retrospect, and is simply cold and difficult when you are actually living in it. Cold because the walls were thin and the heating was minimal, and a Paris winter does not care that you have just arrived from Warsaw and spent years saving for the privilege. The ceiling was low and the light was bad, and she studied by candlelight because there was no other light to study by, and she wore every layer she had and piled the furniture on her bed for warmth on the nights when even the thin coal ration she allowed herself was not quite enough. She sometimes forgot to eat. She sometimes forgot to eat not out of carelessness, but out of absolute absorption. Sitting with a book in the cold, still air of that small room, the words pulling her so completely away from the physical fact of herself that hours would go by and the hunger would become something she only noticed later, when she stood up and the room tilted. She fainted, sometimes, from hunger. From cold and hunger combined, the body making the case that the mind had not been listening to. She fainted, and she steadied herself, and she went back to the books. And she was happy. She was, by all accounts, and by the unmistakable evidence of what she did, genuinely happy. Not comfortable, not warm, not well-fed or at ease or cushioned by anything that money provides, but happy in the specific, irreducible way that people are happy when they are finally allowed to do the thing they are made for, even when the conditions are hard. The Sorbonne opened its lectures to women. This was not nothing. In 1891, it was in fact considerably more than nothing, and she sat in those lecture halls, and she listened, and she studied, and she worked. And the hours she spent there were worth every hour of every governess post, and every delayed letter, and every winter she had spent keeping her own mind alive for exactly this. She was also, evidently, extraordinarily good at it. In 1893 she sat her examinations in physics, and she finished first in her class. First, not first among the women, not first among the Polish students, but first in the class, outright, among every student who sat those examinations. And she was still the same person who had been told that the University of Warsaw did not admit women, who had learned what she knew in apartments that moved from address to stay one step ahead of the Russian authorities, who had spent years in the countryside, living in the other kind of room. She finished first. She stayed. She enrolled in mathematics because she was not done. In 1894 she sat those examinations and she finished second. 2 degrees. 2 different sciences. Finished first and second respectively in a university that had been educating men since before anyone now living was born. And she was 26, and she was thin, and she was still cold in the evenings, and she was still sending what she could back home and trying to figure out what came next. A research project had been proposed. Someone wanted measurements made, technical work, the kind of careful, precise work that required exactly the combination of patience and mathematical precision that she carried, and she needed laboratory space. And a mutual acquaintance thought he knew someone who might help. The someone was a man named Pierre Curie. He was 34 years old and already known within the world of French physics as a quiet and serious person whose experimental work was remarkably careful. He had done important things with magnetism and with the phenomenon called piezoelectricity, the property of certain crystals, quartz among them, to produce a small electrical charge when they are compressed, and to do the reverse, to compress or vibrate when an electrical charge is applied. He and his brother Jacques had investigated this property with great precision in the early 1880s and had built instruments that made use of it, instruments precise enough to measure very small electrical quantities with unusual reliability. He was the kind of scientist who built his own equipment because the equipment he needed did not yet exist, and because he trusted his own hands. He was also, apparently, quiet and somewhat solitary, and had not until this point found very many people he particularly wanted to talk to for extended periods. She arrived in the spring of 1894, and that changed. The first meeting was arranged by a mutual acquaintance, and was, by later accounts, initially a fairly ordinary professional encounter. She needed space. He might know where to find some. But Pierre Curie sat down with this Polish woman who spoke French carefully and precisely, and who could discuss the subtleties of the work he cared about as if she had been living inside the same questions for years, which she had, and he found that he did not want the conversation to stop. He wrote to her when she left Paris that summer, and the letters that followed were not only about physics, though they were also about physics. They were the letters of a person who has discovered, unexpectedly and perhaps somewhat to his own surprise, that he has found someone he would very much like to keep talking to. She was cautious. She was returning to Poland, she said. She was thinking of going home, of finding a position there, of making her life in the place she had come from. She was not sure Paris was her future. He wrote back, more than once, and with the quiet persistence of a man who does not say things he does not mean, that he hoped she would come back. That he believed, he wrote, that their scientific interests would complement each other's. That he thought they might do good work together. And underneath those careful sentences, which she certainly understood, and which she answered with care, and her own kind of cautious warmth, was the simpler truth that he had been lonely for a long time, and had not known it quite as clearly as he knew it now. She came back to Paris. She came back and she stayed, and by 1895 they had decided to marry. And they did so on the 26th of July of that year in a simple civil ceremony with no church and no elaborate dress and no lace. She wore dark blue. She chose dark blue deliberately and practically, a dress she could wear to work afterward, a dress that would not show the marks of a laboratory, a dress that said something, quietly, about who she was and what she thought the occasion was for. The ceremony was small, and they had almost no money, and they did not care, either of them, about the things they did not have, and after it they went on a bicycle tour of the French countryside for a honeymoon, the two of them on bicycles in the summer, moving through the kind of green and unhurried French landscape that in July smells of warm grass and slow rivers and the particular ease of a world temporarily at rest. They had bicycles and enough money for a few weeks of modest travel and each other, and it appears to have been, by both their accounts, a very good honeymoon. This is the other thing that gets compressed or skipped when people tell her story quickly, not just the waiting years and the governess work and the Polish winters, but also this, that she was, for a significant stretch of her life, apparently happy in the ordinary domestic way as well as in the scientific way. That Pierre Curie was not simply a professional partner, but a husband she genuinely loved, a person whose mind matched hers in a way that was rare, and that they both knew was rare, and that the years they spent together in Paris, poor and absorbed and busy and cold and occasionally brilliant, were not a backdrop to her achievements, but were themselves a kind of life. The full kind. The kind with another person in it. She was not in this period a solitary figure battling the world alone. She was a woman who had found, after a great deal of waiting and some pain, a partner. And then there was the work. Across Paris, in the years just before they married, and in the first years of their marriage, science was doing something it does periodically and enormously, and without much prior announcement, it was revising its picture of what the world was made of. The picture had been stable for a long time, or had seemed so. Matter was matter. Atoms were the smallest pieces of it. The atom was, by definition, indivisible. The word itself comes from the Greek for something that cannot be cut. Chemistry could combine and separate atoms, could rearrange them into different molecules and compounds, but the atoms themselves were, in the standard picture, fixed and inert and unchanging. You could move them around, but you could not alter them. They did not do anything on their own. In 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel was investigating a completely different phenomenon. He was interested in fluorescence, in the way certain materials glow after exposure to light, and in the course of that investigation he discovered something that did not fit the picture at all. Uranium salts, he found, were emitting some kind of radiation, not in response to light, not because he had activated them in any way, simply continuously, on their own, without any external trigger. Uranium was sending out invisible rays that could expose a photographic plate the way light could penetrate paper and metal foil, could do things that matter was not, under the standard picture, supposed to be able to do. The rays were real and they were measurable, and Becquerel did not, quite, know what to make of them. He published his findings. The scientific world took note, considered the matter interesting, and mostly moved on to other things. Marie Curie was looking for a subject for her doctoral research. She had her 2 degrees, she had Pierre. She had access now to a small, unheated storage room in the School of Physics and Chemistry that served, barely, as a laboratory. She read Becquerel's papers, and she chose uranium rays as her topic. This choice, which she made quietly and practically and without fanfare, turned out to be one of the most consequential research decisions in the history of science. But she could not have known that, and it would be wrong to say she did. She chose it because it was an open question, because it was a real phenomenon that had not been explained. Because there was, in those uranium rays, something genuinely unknown, and she was constitutionally drawn to the genuinely unknown the way some people are drawn to puzzles or to high places. She chose it because nobody had yet looked at it carefully and with the right instruments, and she had access to the right instruments, or to Pierre, who could build them. The instrument at the heart of what followed was an electrometer. Not any electrometer, a specific kind, built on the piezoelectric quartz principle that Pierre and his brother Jacques had investigated so carefully years before. What piezoelectric quartz can do, among other things, is produce a very small, very precise, very measurable electrical current when it is put under pressure. Pierre had used this understanding to build instruments of unusual sensitivity, devices that could detect and measure electrical charges far smaller than what the instruments of the day could normally perceive. The idea Marie brought to the work was this: the uranium rays, whatever they were capable of making the air around them conduct electricity. They ionized the air. They knocked electrons loose from the air molecules and created charged particles, ions, that could carry an electrical current through the gas. And if the air near the uranium was conducting electricity, then a very sensitive instrument placed in that air could measure that current, could turn the invisible ray into a readable number. She set up the experiment. Uranium salt on one plate, a second plate some distance from it, a small air gap between them, Pierre's electrometer connected to the system. She placed a known quantity of uranium compound in the apparatus. She read the electrometer. She recorded the number. Then she changed the conditions. She changed the shape of the compound, the chemical form, the way it was arranged. The number did not change. She tried a different compound, a different uranium salt, a different arrangement. The number tracked the amount of uranium present and only the amount of uranium present, with a precision that was, for the instruments of the time, extraordinary. No matter how she presented the uranium to the apparatus, no matter what chemical compound she used or what form it was in, the radiation it produced was always directly proportional to the quantity of uranium in the sample. This was not, on the surface, a dramatic finding. But think carefully about what it meant. Chemistry acts on molecules. It combines and separates atoms into different structures, different compounds, different arrangements. If the radiation had been a chemical phenomenon, if it was something uranium did in interaction with other elements, or in response to its molecular arrangement, or as a result of some reaction, then changing the compound, changing the chemistry, should have changed the measurement. But it did not change. The measurement tracked the uranium, only the uranium, as if the uranium itself were the source, as if the radiation were coming from inside the atom rather than from anything the atom was doing in relation to its neighbours. Whatever was producing those rays was not chemistry, it was something deeper than chemistry. Something coming from inside the uranium atom itself, from some level of matter that chemistry, the science of molecular arrangements, had no way to reach. She knew what this meant before she had the words for it. The atom was doing something. The indivisible, inert, fixed atom of the standard picture was doing something on its own, quietly, continuously, without any trigger and without any chemical context, emitting energy from somewhere inside itself. The picture was wrong, or incomplete, or both. She coined a word for it. She called it radioactivity. Not Becquerel's rays, not uranium emissions, not spontaneous radiation, radioactivity, from the Latin for ray, a single term that gathered up the whole phenomenon and named it as a thing in itself, a property of matter, the property of emitting rays from inside the atom without any chemical cause. The word was hers. It is still the word we use every time anyone says radioactive, in a physics classroom, in a hospital where radiation therapy is treating a tumour, in a news report about nuclear power or contaminated groundwater or the disposal of spent fuel rods. They are using the words she made. She was still in the cold, unheated room at the School of Physics and Chemistry. She was still thin and often hungry. She had Pierre and her notebooks and the careful columns of numbers that her electrometer readings produced, and she had this new, enormous thing she had found at the bottom of Becquerel's observation. This property of matter that meant the atom was not what everyone had assumed. This crack in the foundation of the physics of the century. She did not know yet how deep it went. She had only just pushed the door open. But she had pushed it open, and she had named the room beyond it, and now she was going to go in. She measured everything she could find. She tested every element she had access to, every compound, looking for the property she had isolated in uranium. looking to see whether uranium alone could do this thing, or whether the atom's interiority, its hidden autonomous self, was a broader feature of matter. Most elements showed nothing. Most were inert in the way the standard picture assumed. Thorium, she found, was also radioactive. Thorium, too, was emitting those ionizing rays from somewhere inside its own structure, in proportion to the amount of thorium present, by the same logic that governed uranium. Two elements now, a phenomenon, not an anomaly. And then she measured pitchblende. Pitchblende is an ore. It is a heavy, dark, dense mineral, a form of uraninite, and it contains uranium that was known and had been known for decades. The logical expectation, given what she had found, was that pitchblende's radioactivity would correspond to its uranium content. More uranium, more radioactivity, in the direct proportion she had already established. She placed pitchblende in her apparatus and read the electrometer, and the number was wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong in a way that stopped her. Pitchblende was more radioactive than its uranium content alone could explain. Not a little more. Significantly, undeniably more radioactive than even pure uranium would be at the same quantity. The measurement insisted on it. She repeated the measurement. It said the same thing. She checked everything she could check, and the numbers still said the same thing. With the quiet, implacable stubbornness of a true result, something in pitchblende was producing radioactivity that the uranium could not account for. And if radioactivity came from inside atoms, and if pitchblende had more radioactivity than its uranium could explain, then pitchblende must contain something else. Something that was also radioactive. Something that was, in fact, more radioactive than uranium, because even in very small quantities, in the trace amounts that would explain the discrepancy in her measurements, it was producing a signal that outweighed all that uranium. There was something else in the ore. Something unknown. An element that had never been named or isolated or seen, hiding in the dense black rock in quantities so small that chemistry had not found it yet, but revealing itself through its own nature, through the very property she had just defined, as if radioactivity were the element's way of saying, "I am here, even if you cannot see me yet. I am here, and I am warm, and I am giving off light. And if you are patient enough and careful enough with your instruments, you will find me." She was both. Patient, careful, and she had Pierre, who had heard her describe these numbers and who set aside the work he was doing. Significant work, research into magnetism and temperature that he had every reason to keep pursuing, and turned his full attention to hers, because he understood what she had found. He understood it in the way that one physicist recognizes the weight of another physicist's evidence, when the evidence is the kind that changes the subject of physics entirely. He set down his own notebooks and picked up hers, and together, in the cold, unheated rooms of the School of Physics and Chemistry, they began to look for whatever it was that pitchblende was hiding. This is where part 2 ends. But it is not where the story ends. What they found in that pitchblende, and what the finding cost them, and what it cost her above all, slowly, invisibly, in the tissue of her hands and the marrow of her bones, that is the next descent, and the one after it, and the one after that. The ore was there, waiting for them. The shed was coming. The iron rod nearly her own height was coming, and the boiling cauldrons, and the light that glowed in the dark, like something from a children's story about wishes, and the atomic weight that she would coax from a mountain of rock, one careful measurement at a time. The glow was coming. She was walking toward it, and somewhere in the years ahead, still far from where we are tonight, the lead-lined boxes were coming too. But she did not know any of that. She was standing at the electrometer in a cold room with a column of numbers that did not add up, and she was absolutely certain that the numbers were right, and she was about to change the world. Let that be the last thought for now. Let it rest there, the numbers and the certainty, and the cold room where everything was about to begin. You do not need to follow her forward tonight. There is time. There is more than enough time, and the story will still be here when you are ready for it. Just let it hold there in the quiet, a woman and her instrument and the numbers that said, something is hidden, something is here. The world is stranger and deeper and more alive than anyone has yet admitted. So she went looking, and Pierre went with her. It was the simplest thing and the most extraordinary thing, what he did. He had his own work. He had lines of inquiry that had occupied him for years, careful geometries of magnetism, the precise behavior of crystals under pressure, ideas that were genuinely his and genuinely unfinished. And he set them down. He folded them away as a person folds a letter they mean to return to, and he turned entirely toward what she had found. Because what she had found was, he understood, more interesting than anything else in the building. More interesting, possibly, than anything else in the world. She had told him about the numbers. She had shown him the readings. The pitchblende was wrong. That was the plain and simple fact of it, and the plainness of it made it stranger, not less so. Pitchblende was an ore, a dark, heavy, somewhat unremarkable mineral that had been mined in Bohemia for centuries, mostly for its uranium content, which was used in glassmaking to give glass a greenish-yellow tint that people found beautiful. The uranium in pitchblende was known. Its quantity could be calculated. And Marie had now measured the radioactivity of uranium precisely enough, carefully enough, to know exactly how much emission a given amount of uranium should produce. The pitchblende produced more. Much more. Far more than its uranium content could account for. She ran the measurements again. She tried different samples from different sources. She measured as slowly and as precisely as the electrometer would allow, which was very slowly and very precisely indeed, because Pierre and his brother Jacques had spent years perfecting the instrument, and it was one of the finest measuring devices in Paris. And the answer kept coming back the same. The pitchblende was giving off more radiation than the uranium inside it could possibly generate. There was only one conclusion the numbers permitted. Something else was in the pitchblende. Something they did not know about. Something more radioactive than uranium. More radioactive than anything yet discovered, hiding inside a mineral that had been sitting in laboratories and glass factories for generations without anyone noticing, because no one had yet had the means or the reason to measure it in quite this way. Pierre understood immediately. He set his work aside and came to stand beside her. They did not announce anything yet. They had no element to show, no substance they could weigh or photograph or pour into a dish. They had a discrepancy. They had a number that didn't fit, and a theory about what the number meant, and a great deal of work ahead of them before the theory became something more than that. In science, a discrepancy is not a discovery. A discrepancy is an invitation. What you do with the invitation is the work, and the work was enormous. Pitchblende, when it arrives from the mines of Bohemia, is not a clean thing. It is a dense, irregular ore, dark brown and black, heavy in the hand, smelling faintly of old stone and iron. to find what was inside it, to separate whatever unknown element was hiding among its uranium and lead and bismuth and barium and a dozen other compounds, they would need to process it in bulk. They would need tons of the material, processed chemically, separated into fractions. Each fraction measured, the most radioactive fractions isolated and processed again and again and again in a narrowing series of steps that moved, gradually and with enormous labour, toward whatever was actually there. The university gave them a space for this. It was a shed, really, an old wooden building in the courtyard of the School of Physics and Chemistry, which had once been used as a dissecting room and then more or less abandoned. It had a glass roof that let in light, but also let in water when it rained. It had a dirt floor. It had a small cast-iron stove that did not do much against the cold of a Paris winter, and a collection of battered wooden tables that were not entirely level, and gaps in the walls through which the wind moved freely. Which mattered, because the fumes from the chemical processes they would be running were not the kind of fumes one wanted to breathe in an enclosed space. The chemist Wilhelm Ostwald, a man of considerable standing in European science, visited this shed sometime in the years when the Curies were working there. He described it afterward as a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. He meant it as a criticism of the conditions, and it was accurate. There was nothing romantic about the space. It was cold in winter and stifling in summer, and inadequately ventilated in all seasons. The equipment was basic. The tables were scarred and uneven. The tools of the work were not the gleaming instruments of a well-funded laboratory, but the blunt implements of an operation that was, in its physical reality, closer to an industrial process than to what most people imagine when they picture scientific discovery. Marie stirred boiling cauldrons of pitchblende residue with an iron rod that was nearly her own height. Let that image hold for a moment, because it deserves to. She was a slight woman, not tall, and the rod she used to stir the material, to move tons of processed ore through the chemical baths that would separate its fractions, was nearly as long as she was. She was standing over open vats of material that gave off heat and chemical fumes in a building that was essentially a large, poorly maintained shed, doing work that was in its physical demands closer to what happened in a tannery or a dye works than to what happened in the quiet precision of a physics laboratory. And she was doing this systematically, methodically, with exact measurements and meticulous records, because the point was not the stirring was just the means, the point was the numbers that came after, when each separated fraction was brought to the electrometer and measured, and the most radioactive portion was set aside for the next round. Pierre worked alongside her on the chemical separations when he could. He also continued to investigate the physical properties of radium and polonium as their concentrations increased, measuring the radiation itself, its behavior in magnetic fields, its ability to ionize air, the heat that radium gave off continuously, which was one of its stranger features and one that would later prove important. But much of the heavy labor of the shed fell to her. The hauling and lifting and stirring, the managing of the processes, the keeping of the records. She lost weight. Her hands were raw from the chemical baths, cracked at the knuckles, and they would heal slowly because her body's capacity for repair was being diminished, very gradually, by the same invisible energy she was measuring. She did not know that yet. Neither of them did. No one did. In July of 1898, after months of work, they had concentrated the radioactive material enough to be confident that they were looking at something genuinely new, a new element. the most radioactive thing yet encountered, hiding in the bismuth fraction of the pitchblende. They announced it carefully in a paper presented to the French Academy of Sciences. They called it polonium. The name was Marie's choice, and the choice was not arbitrary and not merely sentimental, though it was sentimental too. Poland did not exist, or rather, Poland existed in the memories of the people who had lived in it, in the language they had been forbidden to teach in schools, in the songs and the history that had been taught in rotating apartments in Warsaw while Russian inspectors walked the official corridors. But on the maps of 1898, there was no Poland. The country had been partitioned and absorbed and erased. The Congress Poland, in which Maria Skłodowska had been born, was a province of Russia, administered in Russian, named in Russian, existing under Russian law. The name of the country had been, as far as any official document was concerned, removed from the world. She put it back. She put it in the periodic table, in the column of elements that would be read and referenced and written down in laboratories everywhere for as long as chemistry continued to be practiced. Polonium, element 84. Named for a nation that had been told it no longer existed, it was, among other things, a political act. An act of the kind that has no press conference and issues no statement and makes no argument in words because it does not need to. The name said everything it needed to say. But polonium, as it turned out, was not the most remarkable thing in the pitchblende. Polonium was extraordinary. But something else was more extraordinary still. In December of that same year, 1898, only a few months after the polonium announcement, they presented a second paper to the Academy of Sciences. They had found evidence of another new element, this one hidden in the barium fraction of the pitchblende residue. It was intensely radioactive. More radioactive than polonium. More radioactive than uranium. More radioactive, in fact, than anything yet discovered, by a considerable margin. They named it radium, from the Latin for ray. And radium glowed, not brightly, not like a lamp or a candle or anything so straightforward. It glowed the way a thought glows sometimes, just at the edge of sleep, faintly, softly, in a colour that was not quite green and not quite blue, and that you were not entirely sure you were seeing until you looked away and found that the darkness where it had been was a slightly different shade of darkness. It gave off its own light continuously, without being heated, without being connected to anything, without consuming itself in any way that could be measured from one day to the next. It was simply luminous. A substance that carried its own glow from the inside, the way the deepest parts of the ocean carry creatures that make their own light in the dark, for reasons of their own. And it gave off heat. Continuously, radium placed in a container would raise the temperature of the air around it, steadily, indefinitely, without any apparent source. A gram of radium, not that they had a gram yet, not that anyone had a gram yet, would produce, in the course of an hour, heat enough to melt its own weight in ice. Where the energy came from was not yet understood. It would take years and Einstein and a new understanding of what atoms actually were before the source became clear. But the heat was measurable, undeniable, and deeply strange. They knew they had found something that mattered enormously. They also knew they had not yet found radium. Not quite. Not yet. They had found evidence of radium, a fraction of pitchblende residue that was intensely radioactive, that contained something that behaved like a new element, that produced spectral lines no one had seen before. But to confirm an element's existence, to make the case that would satisfy the Academy and the international community of chemists, you needed a sample. You needed something you could weigh, something with a measurable atomic weight. And radium was present in pitchblende in minute quantities, far smaller than polonium. To get even a fraction of a gram of radium chloride, purified, concentrated, real, they would need to process tons of ore. So they went back to the shed. And they kept working. The ore came from the mines of Bohemia, pitchblende residue from which the uranium had already been extracted for industrial use, which made it cheaper and more available, and which still contained the radium because the uranium extraction process did not touch it. It arrived in sacks and was hauled into the shed. It was dissolved in acid. The resulting solution was treated with a series of chemical agents that caused different elements to precipitate out at different stages, each precipitation narrowing the field, each separated fraction measured at the electrometer to determine which contained the highest concentration of radioactivity. The work took 4 years, from roughly 1898 to 1902, with interruptions for illness and exhaustion and the ordinary demands of 2 lives being lived simultaneously, teaching, housekeeping, raising their daughter Irene, who had been born in 1897, Marie and Pierre worked through ton after ton of pitchblende residue in the shed that Ostwald had described as something between a stable and a potato cellar. In the summers, when the chemical fumes were worst, they moved their operations outside into the courtyard, working in the open air with the Parisian sky above them and the sounds of the city all around them, stirring their cauldrons and measuring their fractions in weather that was sometimes accommodating and sometimes not. The scale of the physical work is worth staying with for a moment, because it is easy to let the scientific precision of what they were doing obscure the sheer material reality of it. Marie herself, in later years, said that this was the hardest period of her life, and also, in some ways, the one she remembered with the most warmth. Not because it was easy, it was not easy in any dimension, but because the difficulty was comprehensible, and the goal was clear, and the progress, however slow, was progress that could be measured. Every fraction she concentrated was a step. Every measurement was information. The numbers were building toward something, and she could feel that they were. Even in the years when the gram of radium was still invisible and hypothetical and enormously far away. By 1902 she had it. Not a gram. Not even close to a gram. But she had isolated approximately 1/10 of a gram, 1 decigram, of radium chloride from a starting material of roughly a ton of pitchblende residue. And from this sample, measured with the same meticulous patience she had applied to everything, she determined radium's atomic weight. It was approximately 225 to 226. The measurement was precise enough to be taken seriously, to be published, to withstand scrutiny. Radium was real. It had a weight. It existed. The atomic weight meant that radium could be placed in the periodic table. In the column with barium and calcium, the alkaline earth metals, below them in a position that its chemical properties predicted and that its weight confirmed. There was a place for it, had always been a place for it, waiting quietly in the architecture of the table that Mendeleev had drawn up 30 years before. The table had a gap. Radium filled it. Marie completed her doctoral thesis in 1903. It was titled, in translation, Researches on Radioactive Substances, and it described the discovery of polonium and radium and the methods by which they had been isolated and measured. The committee that examined it called it the greatest contribution to science ever made by a doctoral thesis. She was the first woman in France to receive a doctorate in physics, and at night, sometimes, the two of them would go back to the shed. Not to work. Not in the formal sense of that word. There was no experiment to run, no measurement to take, no fraction to stir or to separate. But they would go back in the evenings, after their daughter was asleep, and the day's formal work was done, and they would open the shed in the dark, and they would stand there and look at what they had made. The tubes and dishes of concentrated radium and its compounds glowed. Faintly, steadily, a soft, sourceless luminosity in the darkness of the shed, as though the material itself contained a small private light that it was not quite willing to put away for the night. She described this light herself in something she wrote later as looking like faint fairy lights. And the description is exact in a way that a more precise description would fail to be, because what she saw was not a bright thing, not a dramatic thing, not a thing that announced itself. It was a thing you had to let your eyes adjust to, a thing that revealed itself slowly, a glow that was more like a quality of the darkness than like a light within it. The way some nights have a quality of luminosity that is not quite explained by the moon. She found it beautiful. Pierre found it beautiful. They stood in the shed in the dark and looked at the substance that had taken 4 years and tons of rock to isolate, and they found the light it gave off, the light that was a byproduct of the invisible energy passing through it and through the air around it, and through their own hands and bodies as they stood there, beautiful. The light was already writing itself into her. She did not know this. The thought had no form yet, no language, no framework in which it could be understood. Radiation as a hazard to biological tissue was not a concept that existed in any developed form in 1902. The burns on her hands she attributed to the chemical work. The fatigue she attributed to the years of physical labour and the cold shed and the insufficient food and the demands of keeping a home and a scientific career running simultaneously. She was tired because the work was hard. That was the only available explanation, and it was not entirely wrong. But the light she was looking at was not separate from her. It was passing through her, and the atoms it came from would still be doing exactly this, releasing exactly this energy, in the same slow, continuous way, for a very long time after she was gone. In the autumn of 1903, the Nobel Prize in Physics was announced. It was to be awarded jointly to Henri Becquerel and to Pierre Curie and to Marie Curie for their work on radiation and radioactivity. But this announcement, as it was publicly presented, obscures something that happened before the announcement, something that did not become widely known until later and that changes the shape of the story considerably. The committee had initially considered awarding the prize to Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie. Only those two. Becquerel for the original discovery of uranium rays in 1896, Pierre for the subsequent work on radioactivity. Marie's name had been left out of the earliest discussions, either through oversight or through the particular quality of attention that institutional bodies sometimes give to the work of women, which is to say, a slightly different quality of attention than they give to men. Pierre found out, and Pierre objected. He made clear to the committee, in terms that apparently left no room for ambiguity, that the work they were proposing to honour had been Marie's from the beginning, that she had identified the phenomenon of radioactivity as a subject of systematic study, that she had coined the term, that she had demonstrated that the effect arose from within the atom rather than from any chemical property of the uranium compound, and that the discovery of polonium and radium, while carried out by both of them, had originated in her measurement and in her reasoning. He insisted her name be included. The committee relented. Marie Curie became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She and Pierre did not attend the ceremony in Stockholm that December. Marie's health was not good. She was tired, more deeply tired than she had been in years, though she had no specific diagnosis and no specific explanation, and Pierre's health was also poor, and they were busy, and the journey seemed more than either of them had the energy for. They accepted the prize in absentia and collected it the following year. They used some of the prize money to hire a laboratory assistant, which meant that Marie would not have to do quite so much of the physical work herself. But she did not stop working. She had never stopped working. Work was not a thing she did when conditions permitted. It was the thing around which the conditions of her life were arranged. There was one other thing they did, around this time, that deserves to be held with some care. They had developed a method for isolating radium. A specific chemical process, precise and reproducible, by which the element could be extracted from pitchblende in sufficient concentration to be useful. This method, if patented, would have given them control over one of the most commercially valuable substances in the world, because radium was already being discussed as a potential treatment for certain tumours, because the luminous properties of radium compounds were being investigated for industrial applications, because the scientific community worldwide was desperate for samples and would pay whatever was asked. A patent would have made them wealthy. Extraordinarily, possibly permanently wealthy. They did not patent it. They published the method, completely in detail, without restriction, so that any chemist with the materials and the equipment could follow their procedure and isolate radium for themselves. Their reasoning, as they expressed it, was simple. They believed that the results of scientific research belonged to science, and through science to everyone. They had not done this work to profit from it. They had done this work to find out what was true. The finding was complete. The truth could now be shared. Anyone who needed radium for research or treatment could make it. This was not a naive position. They understood what they were giving up. Marie, in particular, was not unacquainted with financial constraint. She had been cold in a Paris garret, had fainted from hunger over a physics problem set, had spent years calculating whether she could afford an extra sack of coal, and she understood what financial security meant. She chose to give it away anyway, because the alternative was a world in which the use of radium required their permission, and that seemed to both of them like an obviously worse world. They remained, for the rest of their lives, not poor, but not wealthy. They had their salaries, their prizes, their positions. They had enough. And the radium process was everyone's. And then April came. April of 1906. And everything changed again. It had been raining in Paris. The kind of rain that is not dramatic, but is relentless, a grey, steady, persistent rain that makes the cobblestones dark and the gutters run and the horses' hooves uncertain on the wet stone. Pierre was walking. He had been to a meeting of the Association of Professors of Science Faculties, a working lunch at a publisher's house, and he was now walking back through the streets of the Latin Quarter in the rain, perhaps thinking about the afternoon's agenda, perhaps thinking about a problem he had been working through, perhaps not thinking about anything in particular, but simply walking as people walk in familiar cities, with the automatic ease of known routes. He was crossing the Rue Dauphine, near the Pont Neuf. A heavy horse-drawn wagon was moving through the intersection. Later accounts vary in some details, but agree on the essential. Pierre either slipped on the wet cobblestones or misjudged the wagon's speed, or both. He fell, and the wheel of the wagon, The rear wheel, a large wheel of the kind that a heavily loaded vehicle required, designed to carry enormous weight over cobblestone streets, passed over his skull. He was 46 years old. He died there, in the rain, on the Rue Dauphine. There was no illness, no slow decline, no time for anything to be said or arranged or prepared. He had been alive, and then he was not. In the space of a few terrible seconds on an ordinary April afternoon, and the world he left behind was a world in which Marie was suddenly without the person who had been, for 11 years, her partner and her colleague and her husband and the other presence in the shed at night when the tubes glowed in the dark. She was told. She went to where he was. She was brought home. What she felt is not something that admits of easy summary, and the temptation to describe it at length should probably be resisted, because the feeling was hers, private, and the ways she expressed it in the days that followed were the ways of a person who does not perform grief, but inhabits it, quietly, at a depth that makes performance seem beside the point. She wrote about it, later, in a journal she kept in the months after his death, a journal in which she addressed him directly, in the second person, as though writing to someone in the next room who had stepped out momentarily and had not come back. He was not coming back. He was not coming back. She knew this. The journal was not a failure to know it. It was a way of speaking to what remained. The Sorbonne offered Pierre's professorship to Marie. His chair, the position he had held as professor of physics. They offered it to her, which was, in its own way, a significant thing to offer. A woman had never held a professorship at the Sorbonne, and the university's willingness to make the offer at all represented something, though perhaps not as much as it might have seemed, since it was also true that she was the most qualified person available for the position, and the faculty knew it. She accepted. On the 5th of November 1906, she walked into the lecture hall at the Sorbonne where Pierre had taught. The hall was crowded, not only with students, but with journalists and curious members of the public who had come to see the spectacle of a woman giving a university lecture, which remained, in 1906, a novel enough event to attract attention. She took her place at the lectern. She began to speak. Not with an introduction, not with a reference to Pierre, or to her own history, or to the circumstances that had brought her to this room. She began at exactly the point where Pierre's last lecture had ended. The same concept, the same line of reasoning, continuing without pause from where he had stopped, as though the gap between his last lecture and hers were a breath held between one word and the next. The hall fell very quiet. She lectured. She continued the course that he had been teaching. She held the professorship that had been his. And when she left the building, the journalists who had come expecting a spectacle of novelty found themselves writing, instead, about something they had not quite anticipated, not the curiosity of a woman at a lectern, but the strangeness of grief made into continuity, the way a life could be carried forward by another life when it had no other option, the way work, of all things, can be the thing a person holds on to when everything else has stopped. She was 38 years old. She had a daughter of 8. She had a laboratory and a course of lectures and a body of research that was the most significant in her field, and she had the shed still in the courtyard, and the tubes that glowed at night still in the dark. She kept working. She did not stop. She would not stop, and it was not because she did not grieve. She grieved as deeply and for as long as grief requires. And the journal she kept in those months makes that clear enough for anyone who doubts it. She kept working because work was what she had and what she was. Because the questions the pitchblende had opened were not finished. Because polonium and radium were still yielding up their properties to careful measurement, and the careful measurement was hers to do, and she was the right person to do it. And somewhere in the desk drawer, in a small glass tube that gave off its own quiet light, the radium waited. The light that came from it was exactly the light it had always given off. The rain had not changed it. The grief had not changed it. The professorship had not changed it, and neither had the gold medal or the Nobel Prize or the patent they had given away, or the years in the shed, or the 4 years of boiling cauldrons and iron rods and tons of dark bohemian ore. The light was continuous. It would still be the same light, from the same process, from the same atoms, with their slow and unhurried release of energy. In the desk drawer of the laboratory, every night, while she sat at the desk above it and worked in the lamplight with her cracked and scarred hands, measuring what remained. The year 1911 arrived, and with it a prize no living person had ever received before, and a storm of a particular kind that only France, in that particular century, could manufacture. All noise and column inches and nationalist fury directed at a woman who had done nothing except work, and love, and grieve, and work again. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry, awarded in December of that year, went to Marie Curie, alone, not shared this time, not parcelled out among 3 names, with hers added as an afterthought at the insistence of a husband who was by then 4 years in the ground. Hers entirely for the discovery of polonium and radium, for the isolation of pure radium, for the body of work that had grown from those leaky shed years, and those iron rods, and those tons of dark bohemian ore, into something so complete, so thorough, so original, that the Swedish Academy had looked at the full landscape of chemistry and found no one else to name. She was the first person in the history of the Nobel Prize to receive the distinction twice. She remains the only woman ever to have done so, and she remains, even now, one of only a small number of people on Earth who have ever won in 2 different scientific fields, physics in 1903, chemistry in 1911, the invisible energy of uranium or trailing her through both. The Stockholm ceremony was scheduled, the journey to Sweden was arranged, and then the newspapers began. It had started a few weeks earlier in the French press, and it spread with the particular speed that scandal has always moved at, which is faster than any correction can follow. Her name was being connected to Paul Langevin, a physicist, a former student of Pierre's, a man who was married and separated, and who had known both Curies for years. Letters, it was claimed, had been obtained. The details do not matter here, and never did, except to say that what the press chose to do with them was not report a private situation with any care for the people involved, but to use it as a weapon against a woman who was foreign, and who had won something twice that Frenchmen had won once. The editorials were not subtle. They called her a foreign seductress, a home-wrecker, an interloper who had come from occupied Poland and stolen a French wife's husband, and the fact that she had also, in the course of her time in France, discovered 2 elements and reshaped the foundational understanding of the atom was treated in these pages as secondary, or irrelevant, or proof of something else entirely. Something sinister and calculating, because women who accomplished too much were always being accused of calculation in lieu of being credited with ability. A mob, on at least one occasion, gathered outside her house. She was inside, her daughters were inside. The Nobel Committee wrote to her, gently, suggesting that, under the circumstances, it might be better if she did not come to Stockholm to collect the prize. The subtext was clear enough. The situation was embarrassing, and her presence would be an embarrassment, and it would be easier for everyone if she simply accepted the honour by correspondence and stayed home in Paris and let the noise die down. She replied that the prize had been awarded to her for scientific work, and that scientific work had nothing whatsoever to do with her private life, and that she would be coming to Stockholm. And she went. She stood in Stockholm in December 1911 in front of the assembled academy with a plastic marrow damage already beginning its slow, invisible work inside her bones, and she accepted the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and she delivered her lecture, and she said, among other things, that she hoped radioactive substances might one day be useful in the treatment of disease. And then she came home to Paris, and she went back to the laboratory, and she kept working. The world had not finished requiring things of her. It rarely does. Of women who are very good at things the world has decided women are not supposed to be good at. 3 years later, in the summer of 1914, the war began. And Marie Curie, who had spent her adult life making the invisible visible, who had built instruments capable of measuring something that could not be seen or smelled or felt, but that passed through matter as if matter were no more substantial than fog, looked at what the war was doing to human bodies and understood immediately what she could do about it. The problem was this: surgeons in field hospitals were operating on wounded men without being able to see inside them. Shrapnel moved in strange ways through tissue, bullets lodged in unexpected places. A fragment that looked, from the outside, as though it should be in the thigh, might be resting against the spine. And without knowing exactly where it was, surgeons were cutting blind, which cost time and caused harm that could have been avoided. What surgeons needed was X-ray equipment. Wilhelm Röntgen had discovered X-rays in 1895, just a year before Becquerel found the uranium rays that would set Marie Curie's research in motion, and by 1914 the technology of imaging with X-rays was understood well enough. What did not exist at the Western Front was the infrastructure to bring that technology to where the wounded men actually were. Marie Curie decided to bring it to them. She converted vans. She fitted them with X-ray equipment and generators, designed so that a van could drive to a field hospital or a dressing station, and the equipment inside it could be set up and used to image a wounded soldier before and during surgery. She drove one of these vans herself. She trained women to operate them. Young women, some of them barely out of school, learning radiographic technique under her instruction and then taking the units forward toward the front lines and running them. Her daughter Ern, who was by then a teenager, worked alongside her. The petites Curies, people called these vans. The little Curies. The name was affectionate and also accurate, because they were small and because she was everywhere in them, in the design of each component and the calibration of each machine and the decisions about where each unit would be most useful. It is estimated that over the course of the war these mobile radiography units served more than 1 million wounded soldiers. 1 million men whose surgeons could see, with something approaching clarity, what they were working around and toward. 1 million operations made less dangerous because a woman in Paris had looked at a problem and built a solution out of vans and X-ray tubes and her own insistence. She also promoted the use of radon emanation tubes, sealed containers of radon gas, the radioactive element produced by the natural decay of radium, for sterilizing wounds in surgical settings. She was thinking, always, about what the invisible energy she had discovered could be made to do for the bodies of human beings rather than to them. The war ended. the world moved into the complicated 20s. And Marie Curie, who was in her early 50s by then, whose hands had been cracked and scarred for years, whose fingertips had lost some of their feeling from repeated contact with radioactive materials, whose eyesight had begun to trouble her, likely cataracts, likely radiation-related, kept building. She had founded the Radium Institute, the Institut du Radium, in Paris. It was a real institution now, a centre for both scientific research and medical treatment, the kind of place she had been imagining since the Shed years, since the time when she and Pierre had understood what radium might do for cancer and had had nowhere to do it properly. The institute became one of the leading research centres in Europe. She ran it with the same quiet, relentless attention she had given to every other thing she had ever been responsible for, including a set of scales and a boiling cauldron and the education of her 2 daughters. In 1921, Marie Curie travelled to the United States. She had not sought the trip. It had been arranged by an American journalist named Marie Maloney, who had interviewed her and been struck, as so many people were struck, by the simplicity of what she had actually asked for when asked what she needed. She needed radium, a gram of radium. Radium was extraordinarily expensive because extracting it was the process she had invented herself in the shed over years, and the quantities available were still tiny. The gram she had helped produce in the 1890s was no longer hers. The years and the war and the expenses of research had seen to that. And a gram of radium was what a woman who had discovered the element and explained its properties and won 2 Nobel Prizes was lacking, because she had given away the method for free. American women raised the money. A national campaign organized and subscribed to by women across the United States who understood something about what it meant to be very good at something and still find yourself without the resources to continue. They raised enough to buy her a gram of radium, approximately $100,000 at the time, and presented it to her in a ceremony at the White House, where President Warren Harding placed in her hands a small golden key that symbolized the transfer. She used the radium for research. She did not sell it or spend it on anything else. She went back to France and back to the Radium Institute and kept working. She had not changed in that way. The crowds in America, the ceremony with the president, the honorary degrees from the universities she visited, none of it changed the essential fact of what she was, which was a scientist who believed that the work was the point, and that the rest of it was noise, however sometimes necessary, however occasionally moving. Einstein, who had known her for years by that point, and who was not himself a man easily given to admiration, wrote that she was, of all celebrated beings, the only one whom fame had not corrupted. It is a sentence worth sitting with. Of all celebrated beings. Not of all women, not of all scientists, of all celebrated beings. The man who wrote the theory of general relativity believed, after years of watching public life do its work on the people subject to it, that Marie Curie was singular in her resistance to what fame does to a person. She had walked through the mob outside her house in 1911 and accepted the second Nobel Prize, and driven the petites Curies to the front and spoken to President Harding, and come home to the same laboratory and the same work and the same desk with the same small glass tube in the drawer that still, quietly, in the dark, gave off its light. Her daughters had grown. Ern, the elder, had become a scientist herself. This was perhaps inevitable, given the mother, given the laboratory that had functioned as a kind of second childhood home, Given the war years when Ern had worked alongside her mother at barely 17, learning what it meant to apply invisible physics to visible wounds. Ern married Frederick Joliot, a physicist at the Radium Institute, and together they became Ern and Frederick Joliot Curie, a hyphenated partnership not unlike the one Ern's parents had made in a different shed in a different century. In 1935, the year after her mother died, Ern Joliot Curie and Frederick Joliot Curie were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. The finding that you could take a stable element and bombard it with particles and make it radioactive. Something that had never been made radioactive before, creating new radioactive isotopes in a laboratory. The Curie family had now accumulated more Nobel Prizes than any other family in history. The work had passed from mother to daughter like something carried in the hands, not the blood, although perhaps both. V, the younger daughter, did not become a scientist. She became a writer. And the book she wrote about her mother, simply titled Madame Curie, became one of the most widely read biographies of the 20th century. A careful and loving account of a woman Vey had watched up close, in the ordinary texture of daily life, which meant she could write about the scarred hands and the fainting spells and the way her mother would sometimes forget to eat if the measurement she was working on was particularly demanding. Vey's book gave the world not the icon, or not only the icon, but the person, a small woman with greying hair and cracked fingertips, who had stood in a leaky shed and stirred a cauldron and found something inside matter that nobody had known was there, and who had been unable to stop until the matter inside her own body gave out. And it was giving out. It had been giving out for a long time. The hands had been the first visible sign years earlier. The cracking and scarring, and the slow disappearance of sensation in the fingertips, the skin that never quite healed the way skin should after handling materials that were continuously releasing energy into everything around them. Radium burns are not like fire burns. Fire burns fast, from outside in, and you know it immediately. Radium works from inside out, and over time, the energy passing through the skin and into the tissue and the blood and the marrow, and the body registering it gradually, cumulatively, the way water registers cold, not in a single moment, but in the slow, deep, pervasive way that cold eventually reaches every part of a thing submerged in it. She had been submerged in it for decades. The burns on her hands were the part she could see. The rest was happening out of sight, as everything she had spent her life studying happened out of sight. Her eyesight deteriorated. She underwent several operations for cataracts. She had, by the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, the eyes of a woman considerably older than she was, which is what happens when the tissue around the lens absorbs radiation for long enough. She kept working. She minimized what was happening, or she declined to discuss it publicly, or she simply did not connect every symptom to its most likely cause, which was the same cause she had been standing next to and carrying in her pockets and keeping in her desk drawer for the better part of 40 years. She and Pierre had not known, nobody had known, in the early years. The understanding of what ionizing radiation did to biological tissue came slowly and came partly from watching what it was doing to the people who worked with it, which included Marie Curie, whose body was itself a kind of long, slow, involuntary experiment. By the early 1930s, she was tired in ways that rest did not address. Her blood counts, when physicians checked them, told a story that blood counts tell with a particular clinical quietness. The marrow was failing. The bone marrow, that soft, dark tissue at the center of the long bones of the body, is where blood cells are made, red and white, and the platelets that allow blood to clot. All of them manufactured continuously in healthy marrow, the way a factory runs continuously, because the need for them is continuous, because the blood of a living body is always moving and always being used and always needing to be replaced. When the marrow is damaged, the production slows and then falters, and then, if the damage is severe enough, stops. The condition is called aplastic anemia. Aplastic, from the Greek for something that fails to form. The marrow that had been irradiated gradually and continuously over decades by the invisible energy of the materials she had held in her hands and carried in her pockets and worked beside in shed and laboratory and institute, had lost its capacity to make what the blood needed. And without that, the rest of the body could not sustain itself. She went to the Sancellemoz sanatorium in Passy, in the Haute-Savoie region of France, where the mountain air was supposed to be beneficial for people whose lungs or blood were failing them, as mountain air has been recommended for such things since the 19th century and perhaps before. The journey from Paris to the mountains, the white rooms and the clean air, and the view of peaks that are indifferent to the names of the people who look at them. She arrived in the spring of 1934, and she did not return to Paris. Marie Curie died on the 4th of July 1934 at the Sancellemoz sanatorium in Passy, in the Haute-Savoie. She was 66 years old. The cause recorded was aplastic pernicious anemia. The bone marrow had simply stopped, and the physicians who attended her knew, and the physicians who wrote about her afterward knew, that the most probable reason the bone marrow had stopped was the same reason the hands were scarred and the eyes had needed surgery, and the energy in her later years was so much less than the energy of the woman who had stirred the cauldron. The same energy that she had held in her hands for 40 years had held her in its own way, and exacted from her, over the same 40 years, the same slow and patient cost that radium exacts from everything it is near. She was buried first in Chaux, alongside Pierre, and then, in 1995, more than 60 years after her death, the French government made a decision. Her remains, and Pierre's remains, would be moved to the Panthéon, the great neoclassical building in the 5th arrondissement of Paris, where France inter its most distinguished dead. The transfer was a formal national ceremony, attended by officials and covered by the press, and watched by people who understood what it meant, which was that France was acknowledging, in the particular way nations have of acknowledging things belatedly but emphatically, that Marie Curie had been one of the most significant people to do science in France, or anywhere, in the entirety of recorded history. She became the first woman to be honoured in the Panthéon on her own merits, by her own achievement, under her own name. Not as the wife of someone, not as the mother of someone, but as herself. The coffins placed in the Panthéon were lined with lead. This was not theatre. It was physics. Radium-226 does not care whether the person it is in proximity to is alive or dead. It does not adjust its emissions out of respect for ceremony or for rest. The physicists and the radiological authorities who handled the transfer measured the contamination levels in the remains and found them, interestingly, somewhat more modest than might have been expected. Lower than the contamination levels in her notebooks, lower than the contamination levels in the personal objects and clothing that had surrounded her in life. The suggestion this raises, and that French officials noted at the time, is that much of the damage that killed her came not from radium fixed inside her skeleton, but from decades of handling radioactive materials with her hands and from breathing the radon gas that radium naturally produces as it decays. Gas that would have filled the shed and the laboratory continuously. In the years before anyone understood what radon was, or that it should be ventilated, the body bore the damage. The tools bore the record. Because the tools are where the record lives. And the tools are still there. The notebooks are at the Bibliothèque nationale de France, the National Library in Paris, where documents of significance to French culture and history are collected and preserved. There are lead-lined boxes in that library, and inside those boxes are her papers. Her laboratory notebooks, with their columns of measurements and the dates she wrote in her careful handwriting and the names of the substances she was working with, and the values the electrometer returned, in units she had to invent because the units did not yet exist for what she was measuring. Her notebooks. Also, it is reported, a cookbook. A cookbook that was in her kitchen, in the apartment above or near the laboratory, during the years when radium was new and nobody knew to keep the kitchen separate from the science, because nobody knew yet what needed separating from what. The cookbook is contaminated. The pages of recipes for ordinary meals that she or someone in her household intended to cook have absorbed over the decades the same invisible energy that her notebooks absorbed, because everything in proximity to radium absorbs it. That is what radium does. If you wish to consult these documents, if you are a scholar, a biographer, a historian, someone trying to understand something about the measurements she made, or the methods she used, or the exact record of a discovery that changed what human beings understood about the interior of matter, you may apply to do so. You will be asked to sign a liability waiver acknowledging that you understand the materials are radioactive and that you are taking responsibility for your own decision to handle them. You will be given protective equipment, and you will sit with her handwriting, which is still on the page, and which the radium has not erased. Because radium does not erase handwriting. It does something subtler and stranger than that. It remains. The reason it remains is the reason radium-226 is different from most of the radioactive materials that surrounded her in the early years of her work. Radium-226 has a half-life of approximately 1,700 years. Half-life is the time it takes for half of a given amount of a radioactive substance to decay into something else, in radium's case, into radon gas, and eventually, over further steps, into stable lead. Not the lead of coffins and boxes, but lead in its quiet, inert, non-radioactive form, which is what radium is slowly becoming. Slowly, the contamination that settled into the pages of her notebooks in the 1890s and the 1900s and the years after that has had, since her death in 1934, barely 90 years to decay. 90 years out of a half-life of 1,600 years. This means that slightly more than 9/16 of the original contamination remains, which is essentially all of it. The notebooks are as contaminated now as they were when she last touched them. They will be as contaminated in the year 2200 as they are today. The process by which radium-226 loses half its radioactivity will not complete its first cycle until sometime around the year 3500. By then, every building standing in any city you can name will very probably have ceased to exist, and the mountains above Passy will look slightly different, and whatever human beings are doing will be something no one alive today can meaningfully imagine. And the contamination in those notebooks will have dropped to half its current level. The books she held, and the pages she wrote on, and the cookbook in her kitchen will still be radioactive in the year 3500. This is not a horror story. It is simply physics. It is the same physics she discovered, the same energy she coined a word for in a shed in Paris, with an iron rod and a set of scales, and a husband who believed in her, and a vocation that was larger than the life it was given to. The element curium, atomic number 96, symbol Cm on the periodic table, was named for the Curies. And the Curie, abbreviated Ci, is a unit of radioactivity, a measure of the rate at which a radioactive substance decays, also named for them. Their name is inside the language of the science she built, the way her handwriting is inside the paper of the notebooks. Not as an ornament, as a structural component. When a physicist or a physician or a nuclear engineer writes the unit Ci in a calculation, they are writing the name of the woman who discovered that radiation was a property of atoms, who coined the word radioactivity, who stirred the cauldron, who carried the tube in her pocket, who kept working. The name is in the measurement. It will be there as long as people make measurements of this kind. Einstein wrote that she was the only celebrated being he knew of whom fame had not corrupted. The sentence is extraordinary if you let it settle. He was not praising her modesty as a pleasant personal trait, the way modesty is sometimes praised as a kind of decorative quietness. He was saying something about the relationship between what she was before the world noticed her and what she remained after it did, which was the same person. The girl who had read forbidden books in Warsaw in apartments where a lookout stood by the window to warn of Russian inspectors was the same person who stood in Stockholm in 1911 with a mob's noise still faintly behind her and accepted her second Nobel Prize and delivered her lecture and spoke about what radium might do for human medicine. The governess who had written letters from Shuki asking Bronisława what Paris was like was the same person who drove a petite Curie toward the Western Front and set up the X-ray equipment herself and made certain it was calibrated correctly before the first wounded soldier was placed in front of it. Fame had moved around her. It had not moved her. The desk and the work on it and the small glass tube in the drawer with its faint and patient light, these remained constant in a life that had absorbed enormous force and loss and pressure and public noise, and she had remained constant inside them. There is something in that worth holding, in the quiet of a room at night, when the world has gone soft and the day has finally closed. A woman who had been told repeatedly and by various institutions and conventions and social arrangements that she was not permitted to be what she was, and who had, each time, simply continued to be it, who had waited in Warsaw and in Sztuki and had gone to Paris and been cold and hungry and had studied anyway, who had gone to the shed and stirred the ore and done the calculation and coined the word and kept working when Pierre died, and kept working when the newspapers were ugly, and kept working when the Nobel Committee suggested she stay home, and kept working when the cataracts made it harder to see and the hands were cracked and the marrow was failing. Not from stubbornness, exactly, not from the kind of determination that is an act of will you perform each morning in defiance of the day. From something quieter and deeper than that. From the fact that the questions were there and the measurements were hers to make. And the universe did not stop presenting its interior to careful attention simply because the person paying attention was tired or grieved or cold or scared or told she was not supposed to be there. And now she is in the Panthéon, and her notebooks are in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque nationale de France. and the element she named for an occupied country that was absent from the maps of the world sits in the periodic table at position 84, where polonium has always been since she put it there in December of 1898 in a cold shed in Paris, with her husband beside her and the glowing tubes on the table and the whole great invisible interior of matter beginning, for the first time in human history, to become legible. The light from those tubes is gone now. Radium glows not from radioactivity directly, but from the energy of its emissions exciting the air around it. And if you took the tubes from those years and held them in a dark room, the light they gave off would be very much less than it was in 1902 or 1905, because some of the radium-226 has. In the intervening 100 years, decayed, a small fraction of it, 90 years' worth, against a 1,100-year half-life, so most of it is still there. But the glow, as she saw it, the specific faint quality of light that made her write the words fairy lights, that quality was partly in the air of the shed, in the precise atmospheric conditions of that leaky, badly ventilated space, and in the concentration of the tubes as they were then, and it was partly in the eyes of the woman who was looking at them in 1902 and had been in the dark long enough to see what there was to see. That particular quality of light, seen by those particular eyes on those particular nights, is the one thing the physical record cannot preserve. Everything else is still there. The notebooks, the measurements, the contaminated pages, the element, the word, the prize, the stories. But the quality of her looking, the felt experience of standing in a dark shed in Paris in winter and seeing the faint glow of the thing you found, that is the part that has gone with her. The rest she left behind, and it is still there, in lead-lined boxes, and in the formula for a half-life, and in the periodic table on every classroom wall, in every country on the planet, and in the word radioactivity which she coined, which describes a property of matter that was always there, long before she named it, and will always be there, long after the last person who remembers her name has also become the kind of thing that time keeps. If you feel moved, before you drift off tonight, to share where you are in the world, which country, which city, which quiet corner of a continent, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. There is something I find unexpectedly comforting about knowing where the people who listen to these stories are. All of you in different places with different skies outside your windows, all of you lying in the same darkness that she worked in, the same darkness the radium glowed in, the same darkness that is just the ordinary side of the day that always comes eventually and asks you to put things down. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. The notebooks are in their lead-lined boxes, the measurements are recorded, the element is in the table, the work, her work, is finished, and it will keep. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off,